So welcome everyone. We're super excited to get you started with reassessing the NGSS to measure growth. We have a lot of stuff to cover today and we're going to get started. So I'd love to introduce myself and have my wonderful colleague Julia introduce herself as well. My name is Brendan Finch. My pronouns are he, him. I was a middle and high school science teacher in Los Angeles for 7 years. I taught for LUSD and KIPP and Green Dot, Kava, which is a virtual charter school. I left the classroom to build Rocket Lit. That's our adaptive science reading program. And then subsequently we started Inner Orbit. That was about 5 or 6 years ago. It's been a long time. And I wrote a lot of the assessments on the site at that time. And now I spend a lot of time working with thought leaders to better support our admin, students, and teachers. We're actually working on some brand new content, which I'm really, really excited about. And our next webinar will be focused around this new flexible content that we're building that are kind of more informal assessments. And it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Julia.
Thank you, Brendan. So my name is Julia Mota, and I was a teacher for elementary students. Then I moved on to be a tutor when I was moved to an administrative position within the school. And I've been building materials to support teachers in districts with NGSS implementation for the last 2.5 years. And I'm also Inner Orbit's district engagement manager. So if you're interested in piloting or in trying Inner Orbit out with your district or with your school, please feel free to reach out to me. And then back to Brendan to talk about dive into what we're gonna talk about today.
Cool. Thanks, Julia. Good to have you here. So today's webinar is on reassessing the NGSS to measure growth. We want to look at our reassessment strategies and some tools through the lens of the NGSS and 3D assessment. And we're just gonna explore today. We're gonna be here for about 60 minutes. And during that time, we're gonna talk about a few things. So we'll talk about what is Inner Orbit. We'll do some data review with the 3 dimensions. In previous webinars, so in December and November, we talked a lot about pre-assessment, about formative assessment, about summit assessment. We went through data, and we just want to use this as a time to refresh and make sure that we're all on the same page with the 3 dimensions. And then we want to go over some reasons that you may reflect on data. We'll talk about question level confounds and reasons why you might want to reassess there. Also looking at outliers in data as well. And then, the thing that we're here for, which is moving forward with classroom practice. So we're going to talk about some informal changes and some formal changes that we can make to our assessments. And after that, we'll have some QA and chat. All right, y'all, let's dive in. So to get started, we like to introduce Inner Orbit so you understand the view that we take on all of this work. So Inner Orbit's pretty simple. So we do 4 things. So one is we aggregate all of these phenomena. We have hundreds, and I can almost say thousands of phenomena on the site, and we're aggregating even more for students to take what they learn in your classroom and apply it to something new. So you can go through instruction and have some phenomena or some examples that you have students, and then your assessment should feature novel, separate phenomena from the things that you talk about in class. So we see if students can take what they learned and apply it to that new thing. With all of those phenomena, we write lots of question types. There are 5 or kind of 6 different question types that we have on the site. And so we've updated those in the last 4 to 6 months. So we have even more precise tagging for those questions now, which is awesome. And so you can choose questions from our bank and add those into an assessment to give to students or to project up on the board or do what you will so that students get practice sense making. And then we have really detailed reports that come out of that. So as students go through and take an assessment, you get a breakdown of not just that students scored, like 82% on that assessment you gave them, but instead we'll say more discrete and specific things like students were able to use a model to test cause and effect relationships or interactions concerning the function of a natural or design system with 100% proficiency. And maybe we'll say that they were only able to develop a model to describe unobservable mechanisms with 33% proficiency. So we can identify some areas where students need the most support. And so you as a classroom teacher or a department chair or as a district level can really focus in on where students need the most support and where teachers need the most support as well. That's fun. And speaking of support, we also offer professional learning. So these webinars are intended very much to showcase the way that we think about assessment. We're not just talking about our product the entire time, as you'll see. And if you've been here before, you already know that. But we like to talk about the NGSS. We like to talk about the way that we think about the NGSS, hopefully giving you some additional ways to think about that. And we also have professional learning that we do that's more formal, where we will come in to your school or district, we'll deliver professional learning and walk folks through how to get started with the NGSS or with Inner Orbit or with analyzing data or whatever it is. And this is a picture of Aaron in Norwalk, Connecticut with a bunch of our partner districts. If you want to try Inner Orbit or if you'd like to meet up with us, you can click on those 2 links. You can request a pilot and just explore the site on your own, or you can meet with Julia and or myself and get a much more formal walkthrough and ask us questions and get to know this. But we'd love to have you try this out for free if that's something that you're interested in doing. Onward, y'all. So data review with 3 dimensions. In this section, we're going to talk a little bit more about what the 3 dimensions are. We're going to look at what data can come out of 3-dimensional assessments and talk a little bit how we can leverage different dimensions in questions to yield data that we can use as a baseline or an initial assessment before we get into reassessment. So right now we're setting the stage for what 3-dimensional data looks like and what a 3-dimensional assessment might look like. And then later on, we're going to get into talking about that data and those question types. And then we'll talk about informal and formal changes we can make to classroom practice. So this is kind of like the baseline of everything. And then we're going to build up from here. So the NGSS has 3 dimensions, and that's why we call these 3-dimensional standards. If you're not super familiar with this, I want to go over it. It's really, really important that we understand this because this is the premise for everything else that we talk about today. So the 3 dimensions of the standards are, there are DCIs, those are the disciplinary core ideas. We think about these as what students know, so knowledge. There are the science engineering practices, that's the 2nd dimension. These are, what scientists do, so usually what you're doing with that knowledge. And finally, the cross-cutting concepts, and we like to think about these as sort of lenses that students use to analyze and navigate novel phenomena. So the NGSS defines these as what students know, what students do, and how students think. I think the cross-cutting concepts are really, really clearly communicated as lenses for looking at phenomena, like what patterns do I see here? Like is there a causal relationship? And what scale do I have to observe this system in order to make sense of it? And all of these things are intended to come together in the NGSS specifically, and I talked about this a little bit earlier when Julie and I were talking about pre-post tests, with a phenomena or a problem. And in assessment and in the statewide assessments in the states that we support, those phenomena and those phenomena and problems have to be novel. So we want students to look at something new that they've never seen before, to take their practices, their knowledge, those lenses, the cross-cutting concepts, and apply that to make sense of this new thing. And that is called sense making, and that's the big idea of the NGSS. I'm really excited about that. Okay, cool. So now we want to go through a specific assessment. So this is actually an assessment that we talked about in December when we went through a webinar for one of our partners. And they are building, and they have this huge system of these common formative assessments. And so what we're looking at is this small piece of an assessment, and this is replicated. I think that a science coordinator was telling us that they've built around like 200 of these for all of their different grade levels. So they have a crazy number of these. And they use the in-orbit database of these things so they don't have to write them on their own. Sometimes they make edits, but most of the time they use the questions as they are from the site, which saves a lot of time. And that's what they said. So these common formative assessments are smaller assessments. And we want to think about these in terms of how can we leverage those 3 dimensions of the standards, the DCIs, the SCPs, the cross-cutting concepts, to then get some data that's really interesting. And then we can use that data to measure growth later on with reassessments. So these CFAs were short. There were 5 questions total. So in a unit, the district would have students go through primary instruction, and they would take a CFA. And then the goal was after that, they could, have some intervention. This district is on the advanced side of NGSS. Are we just getting started? Are we proficient? Are we advanced? They're moving pretty far into, they're definitely at the edge of what we expect folks to be doing. And what they do is they give a version A and a version B of these assessments. And so we're going to look at the version A right now, which is titled, Why Do We Shiver When We're Cold? And the different questions in this assessment are, so there's content-only questions that are one-dimensional questions. That's that 1D stands for. That means almost always just a DCI-only question. What do students know? Then we have questions that are content and concepts. So those are 2-dimensional questions. That's what the 2D stands for. So hitting the DCI and the cross-cutting concept. And their content and practices questions that hit the content, the DCI, and the SEPs, the science and engineering practices. Those are the 2 dimensions in there. And then we have 3-dimensional questions. We call them sense making. They hit the DCI, the SEP, and the cross-cutting concept all together. And those are all centered around a phenomena. And that phenomena is all about thermoregulation. So the standard that we're assessing is HSLS13. And what we want students to answer is, why do we shiver when we're cold? So we give them a bunch of text and a table of stages of hypothermia, and finally body temperature. So these feedback systems, feedback mechanisms and systems that work within this. So the last time we showed this slide, it was interesting. Somebody wrote in the chat, that they had some concerns about the core temperature of 35 to 32 and 32 to 28 and 28 to 24. it's really, really interesting. So we did some research on this later on, and these numbers are accurate. So if your body temperature goes down, your core body temperature goes down by just a couple of degrees. That is, it's deadly, and it signals that you are rapidly moving into hypothermia, stages 2 or 3. And so just a couple degrees centigrade can very much be the difference between consciousness and unconsciousness. It's really interesting. So stay warm, folks. All right. So this is the phenomena, and what we're looking at here are feedback mechanisms in the body system, or through different body systems, and really looking at sweating and shivering as 2 different ways that we keep that regulation. And now let's go through the different questions that this district used in their assessment to see how they were able to scaffold up that formative assessment and get that initial data, we can call it baseline data or initial data, before they were able to reassess and validate whether their interventions had worked. So the first type of questions that we talked about were what we call core content questions. And so when you think about this journey of students knowing things to asking 2-dimensional questions, then finally to 3-dimensional questions, these are on the far left-hand side. So these are just knowledge only, DCI only questions. So these questions, the question we asked was, the most important function of shivering is and it's all about maintaining homeostasis so the organism can remain alive. Right. So this is just a structure and function question. So homeostasis is the whole, that's what this standard is all about, or that this part of the DCI is all about. And this question is very, very deliberately only asking students about the DCI. We're not asking about stability and change. We're not asking them about the CP at all. We're only asking them about that DCI. So this is very, very deliberately a one-dimensional question. If we can validate that students have that one-dimensional knowledge, then we can ask them more complicated questions as well. So the second question type in this assessment is a content and concepts question. So now we're hitting the DCI and the cross-cutting concept together. We're asking if students understand structure and function in concert with stability and change. And that way we can say, okay, maybe the issue is that students, are struggling with the cross-cutting concept and the DCI together, not just the DCI. Maybe they got those questions right, but they're struggling with the stability and change aspect of this. And so this is all about, what may be attributes of something that is stable or not. And so this question is asking about a person, or which scenario represents a body in a stable state, because feedback systems are maintaining homeostasis. And so in this case, we want to say a person at an annual checkup with their doctor who has a body temperature about 37 degrees Celsius, and that would be an appropriate measure of stability in that system. So we're asking questions right now about just the DCI and the cross-cutting concept, stability and change, and that homeostasis. And then we can go on further if we want to validate that they have an understanding of the cross-cutting concept to 2-dimensional questions with the DCI and the SCP. And so in this case, we'll ask about the planning care investigations and the evidence that we required in order to, validate that something was appropriate, an appropriate measure or not, and also an understanding of homeostasis. So this deliberately leaves out the cross-cutting concept, and we're asking just about the SEP and the DCI. So in the data table shown here, there's evidence that if the body drops below a certain temperature, homeostasis can no longer be maintained and shivering stops. And so this is the point where you're too cold and you're no longer able to maintain homeostasis. So if students answer those questions right, or if they don't, then we can go on to ask them even more rigorous questions. And that's what they did in this assessment, which these are 3-dimensional questions. We call them sense-making questions that hit the DCI, the cross-cutting concept, and the SCP all together. And we think about these as like a ramp for students to go up or, to fall off at a certain point. These 3-dimensional questions will ask, typically with planning code investigations, it is, does the data match up, or is there enough evidence to support this, or what conclusions can be drawn from these things? And so this incorporates both the planning code investigations, the DCI of structure and function, and the cross-cutting concept of stability and change. So we ask students, what conclusion best summarizes the data table shown here. And so we have the statement, human bodies can maintain homeostasis via negative feedback through shivering, whether the kind of feedback is really, really important. But this is a temporary solution. Exposure to cold can eventually lead to death. So they're both looking at the evidence that we have. They're using their understanding of homeostasis and how body systems work together, and thinking about that through the lens of stability and change. So at what point does the scale tip where we can no longer use feedback mechanisms in order to maintain homeostasis? So those are the 3 dimensions that are covered in the standard. Again, this is deliberately a 3-dimensional question. And we like to think about these questions as ways to kind of parse the standard into 3 separate pieces and see if there are some combinations of the standards where students were more or less successful. So for this data set, this is the actual data that was gathered as a baseline. Reserve, some anonymity in all of this. We just used colors. So there are actual percentages on our reports for each of these things. We might say this is, the DCI is 48% and the SCP is 23% and the cross-cutting concept is 32%. But just for the sake of, simplifying this for our purposes, we'd like to give you a second to look through this. So there were kind of three parts of the standard that were assessed here. So there was LS1A. This is a high school standard. And so we only have data for high school. So students did, so you can think about this as red, orange, yellow, and then green, or green and blue is another color we use for the top. But red and orange are, red is the bottom, orange is above that, and then yellow and green are higher. So students, I'm not gonna make any statements about the data set, but I'd like you to take a minute to go through that. And as you're doing that, I have some questions for you. So if this is your data, imagine this was your initial data, your first assessment for students. And this is a common formative assessment, but you can think about it as a a post-test, or whatever you think would be most productive for you. If this is your data and analysis, what would you want to learn more about in your follow-up assessments? So we're looking at this through the lens of reassessment. And so some sentence frames for you are, I would want to ask more questions about this SCP, DCI, or cross-cutting concept, because that score may be influenced by that. So maybe you have some context for your students where you know that this is tough because of that, or this is easy because of that. And then finally, I'd want to see if we can increase the score of blank after we blank. So think about this through the lens of, what may be influencing, and then what would you like to do to impact that score and change it over time. So take a minute, look through the data sets, and you can respond in the chat with one of those things. So picking activities, maybe another assessment or phenomena to review, or that orange score, the DCI. Maybe we could increase the score of the crossing concept if we look at more examples of feedback. I said something similar, which is looking at stabilizing and destabilizing feedback. I think those, maybe we don't always talk about those things really explicitly, but that's a really important part of, especially the three-dimensional question we looked at, where there's a point where it becomes destabilizing, where you can no longer stabilize it. Yeah, and looking at vocabulary too, stabilize, destabilize, negative, positive feedback. Those are all like really specific words. I like that a lot. Increasing the SCP score after we walk through how to answer a three-dimensional question. I think some of those questions are so complex that just having students get time to walk through it is really, really important too. And we have some other strategies we're going to talk about today for reviewing this as an informal reassessment or scaffolding too. I'd like to enhance the cross-cutting concept by letting students study additional feedback mechanisms. So other examples of that, yeah, we could look at things like ethylene, we could look at osmoregulation, we could look at things like global warming, like positive feedback mechanisms, versus all of those examples I gave, well, except for ethylene, are all negative feedback mechanisms. That's great. Love it, love it, love it. Cool, y'all. Well, thank you for grappling with that. I think it's time for us to move on, and we'll talk a little bit more about what happened with version B of this assessment and talk about ways that we can reflect on that initial data. And so I think when we talk about reflecting on data, we want to talk about a couple different things. So we want to set the stage a little bit so you gave an assessment, and now you're going to think about what to do next. And to talk a little bit more about this, I think first we want to discuss what are the different stages of implementation. And I want to think about where y'all are at in terms of your NGSS implementation, and think about ways that you might reflect on data. And then we're going to get into some of the other parts, which are reasons to reflect on data that are more assessment specific reasons. So if you want to reassess, not just looking at growth, but to reassess, then we'll look at those after that. But first, let's talk about these different stages of implementation. So now, we work with districts that are in their emerging stages of implementation. And so we'll call this the initial paradigm shift to Phenomenon 3 instruction. So if you're at a district where you're kind of just getting started with these things, you may want to reflect on, does the student performance reflect phenomena-based instruction and assessment goals? So are students able to answer phenomena-based assessments at all? And therefore, is there some phenomena-based instruction that's happening in classrooms? So if you're just getting started with the NGSS, welcome. We're super happy that you're here. But we want to make sure that we're pushing things forward and validating that there has been that. So one of the ways that we can do that too is to give those assessments, when we're not giving phenomena-based instruction, and to give another assessment when we are giving phenomena-based instruction. So we have some district partners where they're implementing Open SciEd kind of in pieces. So they take a slice of the school year and do their normal instruction, whatever they did last year. And then the next unit will be an Open SciEd unit, which is very much driven by a storyline and phenomena. And then the next slice will be something that they do that's much more focused around classical, or what they were doing prior, and then another phenomena-driven unit. So this, by giving phenomena-driven assessments, we can use those reassessments to measure whether that phenomena-based instruction is happening, and if it's driving students to be able to make sense of phenomena a little bit better. And then if you're past that point, you may be thinking about, we're changing instruction. with the 3 dimensions phenomena. And so maybe we're implementing new curriculum and we're not just getting started with this, but we're doing it. It's happening. And so I guess, is that new lesson, is that new curriculum helping with the SEPs and sense making? And so if that's your goal, then I think you're going to build slightly different assessments than if you're at the initial paradigm shift, where maybe your whole goal is just like having a phenomena. And so at this point where you're changing instruction, we want to say, okay, so maybe we're going to give several different assessments on a single SEP. We're going to reassess to see if we can measure growth on that SEP. A lot of our district partners will just have 1 or 2 SEPs that they're focused in on, and they'll measure, those 2 SEPs throughout each unit or every couple of units to see if students are growing over time. And maybe if you're like, all right, we're not at the point where we're giving SEPs and looking to, measure kind of like these big swaths of data. We are, at a later stage, so proficient/advanced in our NGSS implementation. At this point, and the district that we're kind of talking about today, when we're looking at the data and those assessments, they're validating interventions, they're honing instructions. They've been going through this for a while. At this point now, they are asking questions like, if I try X, then will students do better on this SEP, DCI, or cross-cutting concept? And they're actually making very, very discrete claims about those things, like this DCI element, this cross-cutting concept, or this part of the SEP. So when you're looking at data and when you're thinking about where you are within your kind of like reassessment and your implementation journey, this might be a helpful lens for you to think about, okay, do we just need phenomena-based assessments? Do we want to tie together SCPs and measure growth over time over an SCP? Or are we looking to validate interventions and hone instruction over time? And in that case, we're going to have much more discrete and probably more frequent assessments if that's what we're looking to do. So this is just one lens to think about your initial data. And now let's talk about, so this is kind of like the macro lens. And now we're going to go a little bit more micro to think about this on an assessment level. Instead of like a whole curriculum or, district level, let's zoom into an assessment level to think about some reasons why you might want to reassess initial data. So there are some assessment confounds that we see come up pretty frequently within our work with students and teachers. And so some of those are question level confounds. So there's something about that question that's a confound, and we're not getting good data from that question. We also see sometimes there are outliers in data. So these are reasons not just like that you should give 2 assessments, but that you might consider giving another assessment. Those outliers can be the standard score looks higher than expected, or maybe that they look lower than expected. So those are 2 different ways where we can think about, why we might want to reassess again to see if maybe that data is not the data that we want, or if it is accurate, we just didn't expect it. So when we're looking at those assessment confounds, a couple of the things that we see are vocabulary gaps. Sometimes we see there being different question types, and there being, like reasons why, this question type was a struggle, but this other question type was not. And we might want to consider why that is. And then also misleading answer choices. So the reality of every assessment that we give students is that there are things that might be more or less subjective, and we're always honing and improving those things, but reflecting on those things and saying, oh, maybe students miss this because of that answer choice is a really, really helpful lens to look at that. And then, we just need to include another question on that in a future assessment that we'd like better. So let's first talk about vocabulary gaps and go into talking about, like what a sort of like vocabulary gap might look like in questions. And so somebody already mentioned in the chat earlier, when we were looking at like, why did the data look like this? Maybe there was a gap in vocabulary. And so one of the assessments we went over in our December webinars was focused around these summative assessments, and students were given this question. And there was actually a 29% of students answer this question correct. The question says, in figure 3, fossil Y is not found in the top layer. Which statement could explain why fossil Y is not found in the top layers? And the question, or the answers, and if you look at this is the number of students that chose each answer choice. And so this is from our assessment report. And you can pretty clearly see that students, it's flat. I mean, it's almost 25, 25, 25, 25. Like students had no idea what the right answer was here. And one of the things that we look at when we see this is that the word extinct is only found in the correct answer. And so if students don't understand that word, the word extinct or extinction, they're going to have a lot of trouble with each of these, with answering this question correctly. And so just something to consider is when you're going back through your results in inner orbit, if you go to the assignment report and see this, then you may want to consider if there are vocabulary confounds in vocabulary gaps and question level confounds in the assessment. And maybe you want to reassess in that case. And also, we want to bring up another example, which are maybe there are different question types. Maybe that was an issue for your kiddos. So here we have another assessment given by a different district where we look at, they had a three-dimensional multiple choice question and then a three-dimensional free response question. On the multiple choice question, which is all about this same standard, so HSLS 1-6, students had scored 70% correct. So most students, and 70% is fantastic. Like that's an excellent score. That's definitely proficient or advanced in the case of most statewide tests. I think even for some states that we're working with, even above 50% is doing really, really well. And so students got 70% correct on the multiple choice question, but they scored 46% correct, 46% proficiency on the free response question in that same assessment, which that's kind of a problem because now we're looking at very, very disparate data between that, that multiple choice question and that data, and then the free response question. And so in this case, maybe, we want to think about what are things that we can do to help students with this. And we're going to go over a bunch of strategies later on that can be helpful in, if this is your data, maybe these are things that we can do differently to help students out. Cool. And so we also want to talk about outliers in the data. So we talked a little about some question level confounds, maybe, issues with questions that we want to look at again. And now let's look at the outliers in the data. So sometimes we have data that's higher than expected on one of those standards or lower than expected. And those can be for lots of different reasons. One of those things is that if the score is higher than expected, you may want to consider, did that data come from only one question? Sometimes we see teachers that are building assessments and the data is just coming from a single question, or we're just looking at one question on one DCI or an SCP or a cross-cutting concept, and maybe students have really, really high data. I'm going to get rid of this. Sorry about that, y'all. And maybe it's from one question. In addition, maybe we want to ask different questions around the same standard. So if that cross-cutting concept is like 100%, we're like, that seems weird. Maybe we can ask different questions about the cross-cutting concept, or we can provide a different novel phenomena to see if students, if they were super familiar with that phenomena, we want to give them practice transferring to a different phenomena. And so if the score is higher than expected, these are some ways that you can deal with that. And if it's lower than expected, maybe consider if, again, was the data from just one question? Maybe that one question had one of those confounds that we were looking at earlier. Also, we may want to provide a more novel phenomena for students to practice transfer their knowledge. Like maybe they just need to practice transferring, not just in the assessment, but in a more informal context. And later on also, we want to provide more scaffolding for students within the assessment. Julie and I are going to give some examples of that scaffolding later on, but that may be something that may contribute to that. Maybe they just didn't have access to that question and they couldn't answer it because of that lack of access. Also, sometimes we just need to go back and we need to look at prior knowledge and we need to remediate. Maybe students didn't understand basic particle physics and that's why they couldn't answer that really, really tough thermodynamics question. So we go back and talk about the structure and properties of matter that can help to remediate and help kiddos. And then finally, have students practice this skill before. So if you're asking them to do things like evaluate a model or to revise an experimental design, are those things that they have done in the past? And if the standard says that that's what they need to do, then we should be backwards planning our instruction to make sure that it's mashing up to what students will eventually have to do. All right, so we went over some of the confounds and some of the reasons why you might want to do that. Now, let's look forward and talk about how in our classroom we can make changes to, to move forward. And I'm going to pass it off to Julia to talk a little bit about moving forward with classroom practice. Julia, to you.
Thank you, Brendan. So now that we have data and information on how students are doing, let's dive into some strategies to change these future practices. And first, we're going to go over how you would integrate phenomena in some of your classroom activities to get students used to transferring their knowledge to new scenarios using formal assessment questions in an informal context. The first strategy we have for you is a science talk. And the goal with this is to get students engaged in a structured conversation and encourage a whole class phenomena exploration. So it's important to note that discussion of novel phenomena plays a very important role in the science classroom. And there are three main aspects in which we see this develop. So first, in activities that foster student engagement, in opportunities to practice, transfer, and achieve mastery. And then finally, with scaffolded support. So let's dive into this example about how does our body respond to high blood sugar. This is targeting the same standard, by the way, that we saw in that pre-assessment on why do we shiver when we're cold, which is HSLS 1-3. And here we have a graph representing a study in the figure 1 below. We have a graph representing a study on blood sugar, and it's all about tracked changes in blood glucose and insulin levels in a group of research participants. There are two types of foods tracked in this study, and they are starches and sucrose, which is a type of sugar. And we can also see to the to the right actually, in figure 2, a model of the feedback in the body with high and low blood sugar levels. And we also have a GIF that shows how cells react in the presence of insulin. So for our science talk, we've selected a sense-making question that meets the rigor of the 3 dimensions. And we saw that students struggled with this specific question when moving from multiple choice to a free response question. So it reads, diabetes is a disorder that prevents the cells in the pancreas from properly producing insulin. If one of the participants of the study has diabetes, then explain the following. What differences would you expect to see in their blood glucose levels and responses compared to the data shown in figure 1? And how this disorder would affect the stabilization of blood sugar via feedback? We also have some points or sentence stems we could give students to kick off a discussion. And these are including, but not limited to, my partner and I discussed this, or I agree with this because of that, or I agree with this and would like to add that, or I disagree with this because of that. So what we want to achieve with these science talks is to provide students the opportunity to go through that sense-making experience with a novel phenomena in a lower stake scenario. And we also want them to practice the transfer of skills and ideas to novel phenomena. And let's say the discussion is not flowing as well as we would like. We can always use other talk moves, which are basically probing questions or sentence stems. We can prepare those to support discussion if needed. And we could do quicker turn-in talks or longer stand-up pair-ups, which is a section on our science talk flow. And I'm going to drop the chat, this template, and the protocol for holding a science talk in the classroom in case you want to do that on your own. Thank you so much, Brendan. So we also have a differentiated review, and this is another strategy we recommend throughout your unit implementation. So the first step would be to select one phenomena or one performance expectation. In this case, we're using HSLS13, which again is all about maintaining homeostasis and feedback mechanisms. Then we're going to select one phenomena, and the phenomena we chose for this is regulating blood sugar. And we're going to build 3 differentiated reviews throughout the lens of scaffolding, or through the lens of scaffolding. So we're going to build a mild review with one dimensional previous, I'm so sorry. We're going to build a mild review with one-dimensional prior grade level knowledge questions and ungrade level knowledge questions. We're also going to build a medium review with ungrade level knowledge and more rigorous 2-dimensional formative questions. And then a spicy review, which would include 2-dimensional formatives and 3-dimensional summatives that meet the rigor of sense-making. Then our last informal strategy is annotating phenomena. And this strategy focuses mainly on scaffolding with prior knowledge. So you'll recall that students had previously taken an assessment on thermoregulation. So what we'll do now is we'll use that same phenomenon and the concepts in that assessment to help students make connections between the 2 phenomena around feedback mechanisms. So first, what students will do is to pre-read the text on their own, and then they'll move on to the text to interact. And these aren't in any particular order, the things that I'm going to say. But we also want students to ask questions to the text. So why does this happen? Is there something confusing, or do we not see a connection on this? Then we want to look for surprises. Oh, I didn't know that, or that really stood out to me. We also want to make connections to other things that students know or have learned. So this is related to that thing we talked about in class before, or this looks very similar to that other thing we discussed. And then finally, we can ask students to make predictions about why, when, or how something is happening. So this is what probably causes that other thing. And even though we already went through this phenomena, there is a lot of information here that is represented visually and graphically. So students may struggle with these 2 graphical pieces much more than they struggle with the text. So in this next few slides, let's go over some strategies to help students make sense of that graphical information in this phenomena and connect what they're reading to their prior knowledge and what they learned in class. So if our goal is to help students progress in their sense making, it's always helpful to give them a frame for accessing new phenomena. We always want to guide students to make low stakes connections and access their prior knowledge. So now I'm going to model the process of annotating phenomena in these diagrams for you, which is what I would want teachers to do before having students go through this process in groups or on their own. So let's look at this graph. And I am surprised because I had no idea that we had sugar in our blood. What is that about? A question I had was, why are the red and blue lines almost the same shape? They're very similar. And then a connection I made was, well, they both fluctuate up and down, just like body temperature fluctuates over time. So since that was the last phenomena we looked at, it might be nice to make a connection to something else that has also to do with feedback mechanisms. So moving on to the next diagram. Now we're going to annotate this model with the same protocol and see again if there are any questions, surprises, connections, or predictions that we can pull from this image. And the reason that we're doing this, again, is to illustrate students that they actually should be reading the images and graphs as critically as they're looking at the text. So this time, let's start with a connection. This actually looks like negative feedback. So just like shivering, they're both looking to bring the level of something, either the temperature or your blood sugar, down or back to a baseline. Next, a surprise. I really didn't know that the pancreas had anything to do with regulating blood sugar. That's amazing. And then finally, a question. How does our body even know when our blood sugar is low? So now that we've modeled this process of annotating images and phenomena, some suggestions we have for implementation are here. So first, we're going to introduce annotating phenomena before assessing summatively. This protocol is meant for students to actually practice exploring phenomena on their own without even being graded on it. Also, modeling this process is very helpful for students to understand the process and how to walk through graph data, text, and figures. And then finally, students can start in groups, but there always should be time allotted for individual phenomena exploration to allow students to grapple with uncertainty on their own. For example, with exit tickets or with do nows. All right, so now that we've given opportunities for students to be informally reassessed and provided them with scaffolds to practice sense making in the informal context of science talks and annotations or differentiated reviews, we want to begin validating our scaffolds and interventions through more formal assessment. So in this section, we're going to look at different ways to provide formal reassessment strategies in your classroom, in your school, or in your district. So when we redesign a post-assessment or when we design a post-assessment to reassess for 3D standards, there are two main factors to consider. The first is the phenomena that we use, and then the rigor of questions we're selecting. So let's go over some possible strategies you could take on to design pre and post assessments in orbit or on your own. You could also do this on your own. So we have 3 different modalities in which we could design our pre and post assessment. We could use the same phenomena and the same questions, the same phenomena and different questions, or completely different phenomena and different questions. And I know this was a question that somebody asked in the chat before, like, hey, do you use the same phenomena? So we could use any of these modalities to actually reassess. So if we use the same phenomena and same questions, there won't be as many factors to consider in our data, but we'll be able to see how students progressed in one standard and if the strategies we used in class were actually successful. So something that we should consider too when administering the same assessment twice is that we should give time between the pre and post assessment to avoid students from only memorizing the questions. And for this same reason, you probably shouldn't openly discuss this test with your classroom unless you're actually done with the post assessment. If we use the same phenomena and different questions, you can play with the rigor of questions, maybe starting with only 1-dimensional and 2-dimensional questions, and then integrating big sense-making questions on the post-assessment. This might give us more helpful data and we might be able to see a little bit better what students' growth is over time. You would also need to consider that even with the questions being different, students would still not have the opportunity to practice with novel phenomena in the post-test. So we, again, wouldn't recommend going over the questions unless we've already administered the post-assessment. And then finally, if we're using different phenomena and different questions, students would have a second opportunity for transferring their knowledge to different scenarios, grapple with novel phenomena, and they'll also be able to show real mastery of the standard of the phenomena. But something we would need to consider when we're analyzing data is that there might be a lot of underlying factors as to why students excelled or struggled with one phenomena versus the other, as we talked about before. And this strategy was actually the one that our partners used. So they first assessed with the phenomena and questions we explored earlier on why do we shiver when we're cold. And then they gave students another opportunity to transfer their knowledge on maintaining homeostasis with a different phenomena. In this case, how do sweat glands help us thermoregulate? And now that we've gone over all of these strategies, let's take a look at the changes in the data that these teachers saw or that we saw in this district. So let's take a look at this data. This is the post-assessment data from that homeostasis standard HS-LS13. So we can see that students actually grew 6 percentage points in the DCI, which was LS1. They saw significant improvement on the SEP of planning and carrying out investigations with an 18 percentage point jump. And then we also saw improvement on the cross-cutting concept of stability and change with 8 percentage points of growth. So now in the chat, if we want to talk about this, we can discuss, do we consider that these interventions were successful? And if there's still some work that needs to be done. Given that this data represents 555 students, what can we conclude?
Just for further context, y'all, so red, orange, yellow. So yellow is the highest score color that we see here, and then orange is lower and red is the lowest. So in the previous data set, there were some reds in the cross-cutting concepts and the SEPs, and now we're seeing that there are some yellows. So that is a jump of 2 different gaps. And these are colors that are set individually by school districts. We have some defaults on InnoOrbit, but districts are able to set these colors on their own. So if for your district, 45% is now, like proficient, or if 72% is proficient, or whatever, is most meaningful and helpful for you, then you can change these colors also on your side. I really just dropped a side-by-side comparison of the data so that you can look at it in greater detail. So if you want to look at that, as a link in the description of this video, and you can see a side-by-side comparison of the data in the pre-test versus the post-test. And so to answer your question, Sean, so you're able to see this for specific students. Right now, we're looking at it as a district administrator would see all students that took a common formative assessment. So the 615 students took this first one, and now 555 took the second one. So we're looking at it over multiple different school sites right now. And so this is just the average, the aggregate average of all of those. But you could break it down by teacher, by class, so roster, or by individual student if you want to. And I see somebody else wrote in the Q&A that changing phenomenon questions helped. Still need to work on the DCI and the cross-cutting concept. Yeah, and this district is actually going through very, very specific interventions. And so they have very clear guidelines where what they do is they give a primary instruction, they give that initial CFA, and if students struggled with that, they undergo an intervention. And so what this second assessment is doing is it's trying to measure whether or not that intervention was effective. And so these are specific things that each teacher does where they have to do something different than what they did in primary instruction after they give the CFA. And so if that is successful, then we should see students improving over time. Just another note about this district in particular is they will actually ask teachers to take the assessments before they give them to students. And that way, when students go through and they take the initial assessment, instruction has been designed to lead students up to being successful in that assessment. And if you take the post-test or the second test afterwards, that you can see if there's a way for us to, improve even more over time. We're like, oh, I get it. So that first test asked about this, but the second test asked about this. And so I might want to, consider giving them more examples of evaluating model or writing a CER statement or looking for, evidence that fits with an explanation, any of those things.
Evidently, we see that given that this is a significant pool of data and that we have a significant students taking this assessment, apparently the efforts and the interventions provided for the SEPs were successful. So is there anything else that you see here that we would still need to do?
So there's a Q&A about this, which is that somebody asked if they're struggling with interventions, and we're working on that. So we're actually working right now on building some flexible content on InnoOrbit. So this is in like a beta stage right now. We're just creating the very, very first drafts right now, like this week and last week. So we're working on some of these, we'll call them, I don't think they're going to be interventions, but they're going to be more informal sense-making practice. So giving students better access to making sense of a phenomenon before an assessment or after an assessment. Well, with that, thank you all very, very much for being here. We're gonna go ahead and wrap this up with a bow. We're super, super excited that y'all were here, and I knew you guys could do a good job. I knew we knew it would happen, right? Who's that, Julia?
That's Richard Gilmore. He's very proud of us. I'm very
Obviously.
proud of us too.
Obviously. All right, Richard. Well, thanks. So we went over a lot today. We talked about question level confounds, moving forward with classroom practice. We gave a lot of very scaffolded, informal strategies because this is what we see folks struggling with the most. If you want more formal ways to reassess, then I strongly recommend that you click on one of the links in the chat and either try InterOrbit on your own or meet up with us so that you can get some practice with the site and learn more about it. So click on our calendar, which will drop in the chat. You can also follow us on social. So we've been posting videos on YouTube pretty consistently, and we're going to continue doing so. We've got some drafts that are coming up soon. And if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, it's a great way to do that. You can also email us at inquiries@interorbit.com or just click on the link to our calendar in the chat, and we would love to chat with you all. But thank you so much for being here. It was excellent to chat with you. Thank you so much, Julia, for co-presenting, and I hope you all have a beautiful rest of your day.